By the time I was in my 20s and pursuing an education, I was addicted. Porn was my reward for a hard day's work, and it was also my relief, just to cope with the pressures of life. And I did eventually kind of, I guess, give my life to Christ. That also happened during university. And I sort of knew I had to make some adjustments, and I just could not for the life of me shake porn. That's when I realized I had a real issue. And it's also when I realized how under-resourced men like me were, older and younger, just across the board. Not a lot of people talking about it or offering any kind of practical wisdom. So I just purposed in my heart that I was going to figure this thing out, and then I was going to do everything in my power to help as many other men get free as well. And it took me some time to get there. 2016 was my last relapse, February 2016. We launched Deep Clean in 2018, and we haven't looked back since, but it's been a journey to get here for sure.
Yeah. I want to dig into your book for a second, and I want to quote you. You said that if someone masterfully destroyed the porn industry today and tomorrow there were no porn sites on the internet, a majority of porn addicts would still have a problem. What exactly do you mean by that, and what is the root of this addiction?
Yeah, I think the best way I can explain this is probably an analogy. If somebody was overweight and the doctor says, look, you need to clean up your diet a little bit, nobody's going home from that appointment going, oh my gosh, these ridiculous grocery stores, they sell all these chocolates and all this junk food, and man, somebody should just tear these things down and I would never be overweight. Because we know inherently that kind of thinking is totally counterproductive. And I think in the same way, don't get me wrong, I am not a supporter of the porn industry by any means, but I just know it's only one facet of the issue. And what's causing people to actually watch pornography is much more to do with them than it has to do with the industry itself. And I've seen people sort of blame the industry and blame technology and all these things that have, made it the kind of issue it is today. But the reality is, even if you put those things aside, there are conditions of the human heart that really need to be addressed, and that's where true freedom is found.
Does it surprise you that 68% of professing Christian men struggle in this area?
Not really, and to be honest, the number's probably higher. And I think the reason is there are these extraneous circumstances like technology, which makes it the 3 A's is what we call it: affordable, accessible, anonymous. But there are just realities of the heart. A lot of guys don't learn how to actually own their sexuality and make good decisions in this area. We're so suppressed and stifled and shamed around the subject that when we actually reach our adult years, we have no tools and no resources to cope. So no, it's not surprising. And really the prevalence of porn is just exposing how much we as men need to grow in this area of our lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I referenced that statistic that you just responded to, but another part of that Barna Group study suggested that 89% of our teens, 95% of young adults say that they're neutral as to the rightness or wrongness of pornography. And we're talking Christian young people. What kind of wrong messages have we as a society been giving the next generation?
Well, I think people often confuse what's common and what's normal. And so that's what's happened in our society with the prevalence of pornography. When you think about how accessible it is and everybody's watching it or everybody's doing it, it's common. And especially when you're young, you don't necessarily know the difference between what's common and what's normal. So watching pornography is not normal by any stretch of the imagination, but because it's common, people just think that it's acceptable. I forget if it was that study, Mark, but I know one of those studies done around that time actually showed that a majority of people thought that failing to recycle was more problematic than watching pornography. So that speaks to, again, the commonness of porn, or how prevalent it is rather. And it also probably speaks to the weakening of the moral fiber within our society, where people are sort of condoning these behaviors that are actually very risky. When you're young, you can't necessarily see the repercussions of it, but we see it every day with men who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, whose lives are falling apart because they got exposed to porn at a young age, didn't think anything of it, and are now dealing with the ramifications later on.
Yeah. A question that a lot of people have is this just an issue that men face in the church or even outside of the church? Is this just a male issue, Sathiya?
Absolutely not. No. The stats show, at least the most recent stats I've seen, probably about 2 years old now, is for every two men that are watching, there's a woman watching. And that number is on the rise. And what it should tell us is that this is actually not overtly a sexual issue. I think we tend to reduce this to just like our urges and our desires and those things that are obviously sexual. But what really drives people to porn is usually needs for connection, needs for intimacy, a sense of belonging, a sense of acceptance and affirmation and value and worth. And these kinds of desires are equal among men and women. So no, it's not a female or it's not a male issue exclusively. And it's a huge mistake we're making by pinning it that way, because there's so much shame just to talk about the subject to begin with. I know that as a man, as a pastor's kid, as a former pastor, layers of shame. But then you topple on the fact that you're of a gender that shouldn't be watching it, or, you know, all these kinds of ridiculous things that are spoken over women. And it makes it that much harder for them to get the help that they deserve just as much as a guy would.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you raise this whole idea that it's not just a sexual issue, but there are layers to it. It's so much more to unpack. And in your book, you are so practical and break down some actionable steps and processes that, when properly employed, work, as is proven with many of your clients that you're working with through Deep Clean. Tell us in short about the importance of what you describe, the principle stack. Maybe talk about what the principle stack is and how you implement these practices, or these sort of things that we need to be conscious of in our pursuit of wholeness, if you will.
Yeah, well, we're kind of in the day and age of personality tests, Mark. So, you know, there's always something new on the horizon that people are interested in trying to understand themselves. But what we find is, you know, the way we describe people and human nature and all that, it evolves over time. It's going to change. Principles are tried, tested, and true. They're timeless. And what we've tried to do is build a system that is founded on principles and nothing else, so that 25 or 250 years from now, hopefully the basic concepts of what we're teaching are still relevant and applicable. You know, their expression will look different. So the principle stack is basically 5 principles that are meant to exist in your life sequentially in order, that enable you to really build a solid foundation for any kind of practice that will facilitate recovery. The 5 principles are, the first is control. I know it's kind of like a dirty word these days, but what I mean by control is just identifying what you can and cannot control. The second principle is responsibility. So once you know what you can control, you're taking ownership of it. The third is really having a vision. And it's amazing, you know, when you struggle with sexual sin or any kind of addiction, it can zap vision for your life just like that. And so we help guys cultivate that vision and get something that is going to incentivize them a little bit to pursue freedom, but also remind them on those really difficult days why they're going through this process. The fourth is delayed gratification. And then the fifth is that consistency compounds. And when you kind of put this stack all together and you have practices that kind of solidify them in your life, freedom is almost inevitable. I can't say it quite that way, but you know what I mean. Like, right. It really pushes momentum in the right direction. So that's kind of what the principle stack's all about.
You talk a lot about forgiveness in your book, Sathiya, and this journey of forgiveness that you had to work through in your own experience, and how you're talking guys through this now as they're seeking sexual purity. Where does forgiveness fit into our quest for this, in this quest for sexual purity and integrity between God, ourselves, and others?
Yeah. So forgiveness is man's supreme solution, man or woman's supreme solution. It's interesting that when Jesus taught us to pray in Matthew chapter 6, you know, he gives the Lord's Prayer, and then he could have gone anywhere he wanted to sort of emphasize the different components. You know, he covered a lot of ground in it, but he spends the next 2 verses talking about forgiveness. And he's actually bold enough to say that if you do not forgive others, your sins will not be forgiven. So in this context, when you have somebody who's struggling with sexual sin and they need the forgiveness of Christ in their lives, one of the best things you can do is actually give that gift first. And where this specifically applies is in parts of our past that have led to our sexual dysfunction. What we often find is there's traumas, there's unresolved issues, there were conflicts that were never settled. There's things from people's past that they're holding onto that is causing bitterness and resentment to sort of fester. And it's leading to pornography and other kind of sexual misbehavior as a way of coping with the distress that they've sort of caused themselves. And by walking somebody through the forgiveness process, we have a specific 4-step process, which is to identify, specify, release, and restore. And when you kind of go through this process, by giving them a gift, you actually give yourself the gift. You release yourself from those parts of your past, and you're able to view yourself differently and move on with your life apart from the pain, apart from the trauma, apart from the rejection, and anything else that might have been associated with those events. So when you really walk in forgiveness as a lifestyle, it frees you and it puts you in a position to make better decisions in your life and walk in a healthier way.
Yeah, forgiveness is such an integral part of our journey, regardless of what it is we're facing. I want to touch on this specific question for a second here, because there could be a father watching right now. Perhaps he's struggled in this area, but he's wondering, how do I protect my kids from falling into the same trap? You know, we hear statistics, staggering statistics, about how many children will be exposed to pornography at a young age. How can we protect them if they are exposed?
Yeah, okay, so that is the right question for sure. We want to protect our kids. What we don't want to do is we don't want to overprotect them. And I think the realities are your kids are likely going to get exposed to pornography either by choice or accidentally. And I don't mean to be doom and gloom about it. What I mean is, with that in mind, then, as parents, we can start to think about what is the best way to go about this so that when they are exposed to it, they respond in a godly way. And I think there's two things that parents can do. Number one is start talking about it young. You don't have to go into crazy details. You don't really have to be over the top, but the sooner you introduce that subject, the better. There's this concept, Mark, it's the concept of, it's called the law, actually, of first mention. And the idea is, if you know nothing about a subject, whatever you hear first, whether it's right or wrong, ridiculous or completely grounded, the first thing you hear, you will use as a standard to compare everything else afterwards to. So if you aren't the first voice in your child's ear about sexuality and the dangers of what's online, then somebody else gets to set that standard. And it might be right, it might be wrong, but as parents, I highly encourage all of you, take that responsibility. And the second thing is, the more calmly and the more safely you can talk about the subject, the better. You can't just say, I'm safe. You have to actually show it in your body language, your intonation, the way you handle the subject. Kids perceive every single little thing about you, and the more calmly and confidently you're talking about the subject, the more likely they are to come back to you when they have questions or when they actually do get exposed to pornographic content.
How does a relationship with God factor into this discussion? Because at the end of the day, we want to be right with God and we want to live a life that's pleasing to Him. So how does that factor into this whole conversation?
Yeah, I believe we have 4 core needs that drive a majority of our behavior. I talk about it in the book. In my opinion, intimacy is the need of all needs. And nobody on planet Earth can fully satisfy our desire or our need for intimacy. It's only God. And so in that fluid, dynamic relationship with Him, where you cultivate intimacy, you start to experience a degree of fulfillment that reduces your drive for sexual misbehavior and eventually actually prevents it. And so we talk about that. It's a huge emphasis of our program, because I can't fix people and people can't fix each other. But when you start to experience that really deep, meaningful connection with God, the other things start to take care of themselves.